Host, I arrived at St. Taran S on a Monday afternoon that had the color of dishwater and the smell of old paper. The monastery roof sat like folded slate against a bruised sky, and the bell tower, short, square, practical, had a dull shine where a lightning rod rose from its cap. The drive up from Hallow Vale crossed one traffic light that held green too long, as if it preferred it that way. The wind carried a thread of salt from the coast, even though the water lay 2 ridges over. My ride from the train, a rumbling parish van, left me at the Porter S Arch, with a small apology from the driver for the weather, as if he could do anything about the sky. Inside the arch, stone polished by families of hands that would never be named. A wooden countertop with a bell no one used because pushing a button by the buzzer made the same sound through the hall and into an office I could not see. There was the ordinary smell of hospitality there, laundered fabric, copy paper, coffee, warmed past its best hour. The buzzer rasped in the distance. Footsteps approached, unhurried. When the porter pushed the door open, it sighed like a person adjusting in sleep. Brother Albin was older than the place seemed to want, white-haired with a face made gentle by steady duties. He wore the simple dark robe the house used for work hours, cinched with a rope belt that had a pencil tucked through near the knot. He nodded, the sort of nod that offered both welcome and strictness in the same motion. "You'll be Brother Thomas," he said. His voice was even. "You are expected." Those were the first words St. Taran spoke to me, a courtesy and an inevitability braided together. A novice from the city, mid-30s, new to quiet after years of restless service jobs and a long behind-the-scenes caretaking I never properly named because names make debts real. I had written letters and answered letters, provided references, proved I could turn a wrench and fold linen and keep still when silence asked it of me. A time of discernment, the brochure had said in type that wanted to be simple and sincere. My own handwriting on my last mail to the vocation director looked steadier than I felt. Brother Albin slid a ledger across the counter. The paper wore a faint sheen from the oils of other hands. "Sign and date, please." I signed. The pen stuttered on the first stroke. The ink caught on the tooth of the paper and then ran smooth. I wrote Thomas and the surname I had grown tired of years ago, and the date, and below the date the hour, because habits from other jobs insist on timekeeping. The line above my name had a very neat hand in thin black ink, host layover complete. There was, at the right, a tiny check mark like the head of a nail. I touched the counter with my fingertips, as if to steady myself against a draft that was not there. A printer somewhere beyond the door cheered itself into life and printed a receipt. It made the small sawtooth sound as it cut. The porter tore it off and slid it into a little acrylic stand that read, "Guest House Check-In," in block letters. The paper curled with the humidity and then settled. "Welcome," Brother Albin said again, softer this time. "You'll meet the prior after Vespers. For now, let me show you to your cell." We walked a corridor where bulbs in iron cages hummed a gentle fluorescent note. The hum warmed and cooled with the compressor of a refrigerator or freezer in a room beyond. One of those background pulses that teaches a building S-breath. We passed a stairwell that spiraled tight and precise, stone that had accepted so many steps it seemed resigned. Halfway down the hall, Brother Albin slowed and turned his body a degree to the left, as if calculating a narrow turn around a corner, though the corridor ahead was clear. It was small, a sideways shift that barely touched the air, and perhaps I would not have noticed if he had not also bowed his head the width of a fingernail. We passed an open door. In the room beyond, a long table empty, but for a line of mugs upside down on saucers. Mugs of a kind you buy by the dozen for church basements and fellowship halls. White, sturdy, with hairline cracks in the glaze near the handles. The air smelled of tea gone cold and a cleaner with a lemon idea. The compressor thumped. I told myself every place has its rhythms. I told myself nothing was asking anything of me beyond the usual: obedience, work, the steadying of the animal inside. My cell had a bed, a desk, a chair, a small shelf for books, a crucifix with a face so patiently carved it did not make any appeal, only presence. The window admitted a narrow square of light. Another hum here, closer. The fridge in the guest house kitchenette sharing a wall, perhaps. On the desk sat a thin, folded schedule, printed on the copier's tired paper in grey that faded at the edges. The house hours, work assignments, the rota for laundry, scullery, sweeping, the donation desk in the gift room where pilgrims bought candles and postcards. My name had been written in with a firm hand at certain hours. I liked that someone had taken the time. "Supper is at 6. We have soup tonight, fish tomorrow," Brother Albin said. "If you need anything." He gestured. The gesture included the building, the sky, the room, all of it wrapped into an offer that was also a boundary. His eyes flickered to the hallway, then down, then up, then to my face in a mode that read as a kind of practiced courtesy. He closed the door without letting the latch click. In the small beating ring of quiet that followed, the fridge breath on the other side of the wall seemed to learn my name. The monastery bell sounded, a dull, worked iron tone, as practical as a hammer. I washed my hands at the sink and dried them on the towel folded in the niche. The towel had spent too much time on the line. Its edges communicated stiffness before the middle softened. Its scent held sun and a whisper of soap, and somewhere beneath, old stone that had been damp that morning and never quite forgot. Even with the newness of arrival and the way a room tries to put its weight on a person in the first hour, the house folded around me with the simple promises of its routine. The rope on the bell in the corridor left a small dust of fibers on a painted wall. The stairs down to the church had a shallow dip in the middle of each tread. A narrow window showed the valley, the two-lane road threading between birches, the traffic light that flicked its colors without much urgency. In the refectory, the dining room, the tables were set in rows, places arranged, knives and spoons set with the care you might have for a ritual that is not theatrical, but believes in itself. At the head of the first table, an empty chair. Before it, a plate already served, a cup of broth, a cut piece of bread, a still warm apple sliced with the attention of a person who knows how to cut quiet into wedges. I took a place 3 rows down. The brother beside me bowed his head toward the empty chair before he sat. Others did the same, some with ease that suggested habit, a few with a small theatricality that suggested watching. The prior began grace. The prayer was short and spoken low. A draft crossed the floor and moved the napkin at the empty setting a finger's width. I felt it along my forearms where the hairs had not been ready to stand. The mugs on the tables lifted a breath of steam. The fridge nearby chuffed and settled. We ate. The soup had lentils and the kind of heat that does not burn and yet remains, reminding you of itself 2 minutes after the spoon leaves your mouth. As the meal progressed, the brothers at the head table spoke in their regulated way. News of the weather and the condition of the road into the vale, the expected arrival of a pallet of flour, a phone call from a parish woman who had lost her ring and wanted someone to pray for it. When a mention of the host came, it dropped into the talk like a coin into a cup. Not one of them looked toward the empty chair when the word was said. They looked instead toward one another, each face composed in the schooling of reverence. I have been places where men try to sound more devout than they feel. This was not that, it was worse. The care had a quality of relief, as if paying off a debt in installments and being grateful for the discipline of the schedule. After supper, I washed mugs. The kitchen had the 2 stainless sinks every kitchen in a church building has. The faucet shuddered once when I turned it, then offered up warm hose-scented water that never quite lost the ghost of rubber. The mugs went into their rows on the drying rack. A receipt printer on the shelf nearby, wired to the small device used for recording donations and payments for candles, spat a thin strip of paper, unbidden. It cut itself neatly, and the paper fell and faced me. Host. Comp. The type was faint, like the last echo of an old ribbon. I ran the strip between finger and thumb. It left a gritty residue, and then went smooth, as if my skin had trained it to forget. The compressor in the walk-in cooler kicked on. A planned noise, nothing more. The fluorescent above the service counter flickered and then held steady. The scullery S floor drain exhaled a smell of wet iron and spices that had fallen and been sent down with the steaming water. Brother Julian, the cellarer, stuck his head in, nodded once toward the empty plate at the head table, which had been brought to the counter as if the person had asked leave and been excused. "The host," he said. A statement. I wiped a wet hand on my apron. "I saw the empty place," I said. My voice sounded thinner than I intended and took a moment to find its weight. He watched the mugs, one after another, as if the order mattered. "We leave room," he said. "We have always left room." I wanted to ask, room for whom? I did not. He would give me the same answer at any rate, or a truer answer that I would not yet know how to hear. I slept poorly. New bed, new room, the soft, steady argument of refrigerator and building and blood. The world at 2 in the morning is always a library of tiny noises. The stairwell clicked where a relay worked and did not work. Somewhere a siren moved along the road in the valley. It sounded once and then held its voice, a politeness that sounded like fatigue. I dreamed of green hills. I dreamed of a mug that had been set down and then slid to the edge of a table on its own, and stopped there, like a person who has placed himself on a boundary to see if anyone will notice. Days began in the bell and ended with it, between labor. At dawn, I was in the laundry folding towels that had dried stiff on the line and softened only when my palms warmed them. I learned the roster of chores, sweeping the gallery, polishing the wood where many hands had been, taking inventory in the small shop where we sold postcards and soap. The barcode scanner on the counter beeped a thin, almost apologetic note each time it recognized one of the little codes on a candle or a book. All the beeps in the world become a single chirp when you read the one holding the trigger, and on the third day, the scanner beeped before I pressed the button, and then it did not. And I told myself the module was noisy, static from the weather, or the poor shield on whatever cable gave it breath from the ancient wall outlet. Outside, the rain seemed unwilling to finish. It held the world in a constant and small wetness. Brother Simeon ran a hose over the cloister stones where algae formed after bad summers. The hose whistle at the spigot never quite sealed. The whistle had 2 notes when the pressure was wrong and 1 when it was right. I learned the difference the way you learn the path from your bed to the door in the dark. I ran a squeegee along the stone. The water left a smooth, wet skin. The scents came up in layers: lime, moss, rubber, the unsettled memory of bleach. At the end of the week, the prior called me to his little office and asked the usual questions in the usual gentle way. How was the sleeping, the food, the silence? He asked about the gift shop till and whether I felt comfortable using the little card reader that had a battery inside for when the power went. He asked about the schedule and if I understood the second shift of watch in the guest house when pilgrims came to stay, so that the ordinary world would not enter in the night and disturb the order of the place. While he spoke, the microwave on his shelf blinked 0 per jour in its green numerals, and the fridge at his back made the unsteady breathing of small machines. "What is the host, Father Prior?" I asked, light as I could make it. He folded his hands and looked at the framed poster above his desk, a print of one of those medieval gardens where everything is too neat and everyone looks a little bored. "We hold space," he said. "We hold it for God, and for what God holds, which we do not presume to name." "A custom," I said. "A custom kept," he answered. And that was all. A sentence like a low fence. You step over it, or you do not. And in both cases, the property on the other side remains someone else's. I kept. I did not step. The keeping took places in my body, even if I pretended it did not. At meals, the empty chair gathered a smooth cold in its boards, as if breath had rested there, until it could no longer restrain itself and fled down to the floor. During Compline, the last prayer of night, after the last chant, a draught crossed that part of the chapel where no door stood. In the shop, the receipt printer cut a slip each night with host, comp. It was easy enough to say that the drawer opened by mistake or that I had leaned on the printer. But my hand was nowhere near it, and the drawers were closed, and yet a slip of paper sat waiting by morning, curled slightly, the words faint like something a light is reluctant to show. There is a piece of me that likes the items of a life in order. I have mended other people's guest calendars and had the small animal pleasure of checking off boxes in schedules that are not properly mine. The routine at St. Taran's should have calmed me. Instead, the order began to feel like the careful arrangement of a room on the day before you make a long drive. The smooth bed, the small stack of folded towels, the mug in its place, the note on the counter with numbers written in for someone else. Too ready. Too much setting aside. The brothers shifted their bodies at semaphores only they could read. They bowed at a door that was empty. Always that tiny fraction to the left, as if making room for a friend who never falls out with you because he never speaks up. When peace won't come, the body searches for smaller tasks. I counted mugs. I leaned on the walk-in S metal frame and listened for the click that meant the thermostat had remembered its duty. I learned the numbers of the candles by heart, so that when a pilgrim asked for one with a blue icon, I could say 207 and reach without looking. I memorized the tone of the barcode gun's beep and then discovered with no pleasure that there were 3 different notes. High when the afternoon air held its damp. Flatter when the windows had been open and old stone had released some of its sigh, faintly doubled, when I stood a little to the left of the till. Weekends brought a trickle of visitors. The gift room held a ridiculous array of objects the prior allowed, with a resigned shrug. Soy candles in glass soaps wrapped in paper with short prayers printed on them, little bags of candied nuts sent by a parish 2 counties over. The scanner worked, the card reader worked. I found the pleasure you find in the small handshake of a successful transaction, the ping, the receipt, the nod, the God keep you, said with a tone that tries not to make it sound like a sales script. On Sunday afternoon, the machine printed a receipt while the room was empty. The printer chewed, cut, offered. I plucked the slip from its teeth. Host, comp, beneath the time, 1407. No item, just that. When I pressed the feed button, nothing came. The carriage had finished its thought and returned to its neatly parked place. I rolled a scrap of tape between my fingers, stuck the paper under the little corner of the counter where the wood had a splinter missing. I told myself I was collecting curiosities. I did not tell myself I was collecting evidence for an argument with someone who had not asked to debate me. A state bulletin came up the valley on Monday. The county posted advisories after a heavy rain start. Water treatment stressed in the Vale, boil before drinking, guest houses encouraged to limit occupancy due to strain on the shared well field. The prior printed the notice and thumbtacked it near the porter's desk. He added a note in his spare hand. Guest house closed to new arrivals this week. Ample water within. We will be careful. He drew a small cross next to his name as if to encourage the paper to remember what it was doing there. The house became a little more itself during the closure. No pilgrims to accommodate, no cars in the lower lot. The brothers loosened in their steps in the way people loosen when the day S performance will be only for those who already know their lines. The empty chair at supper seemed more frankly empty when no one from outside watched it as a curiosity. I was assigned second watch in the guest house by a pencil scratch on the rota that had been erased and written again and then erased and then written in ink. Second watch means the hours between midnight and 3 when the world expects you to think badly of it. The guest house was really a little motel grafted on a monastic leg. The hum of compressors under the kitchen, the half-chime contact on the front door, stairwells exactly as wide as one person and a prayer book. I kept the small radio near me, the sort with a little stubby antenna and a belt clip. We rarely used them. When we did, they made the dusty frat sound of a thing that doesn't like being made to speak. I brewed tea and drank hot water with a slice of lemon because my stomach had begun to argue at the worst times. The great silence hung through the house, the truest thing we did. No one spoke. All words were kept, folded as precisely as towels on a shelf. The first oddness on watch came at 01:12. A receipt slid out of the gift room printer and fell to the floor like something that had wandered from its rightful place. I picked it up. Host. Comp. And under that, 2 little rectangles, side by side, as if someone with an unsteady aim had printed 2 useless barcodes. I pressed the radio on my belt and listened to the static that was no one. I breathed in and the building breathed out the same moment. The time passed. The stairwell creaked once, exactly where I stood, and then remembered it had no business admitting a footfall there, and was quiet again. On Tuesday morning, the cellarer showed me how to change the CO2 cylinder for the kitchen seltzer tap. The hiss came when it should. The compressor clicks that afternoon sounded like fingers being cracked in a quiet room where people did not like to be watched. Brother Simeon took the hose to the cloister again and adjusted the pressure until the whistle stopped, because the whistle bothered a man who had stopped pretending not to be bothered by the wrong noises. I began to move my body in a small way, the way the older brothers did, the sidestep, the bow of the head in the hallway where there was no one. A courtesy, a custom kept. You do ridiculous things to tell yourself you belong. The prior stopped me near the stair at Nona's and touched my sleeve with 2 fingers, as if checking the fabric's truth. "You don't need to step aside," he said, not unkindly. "I've seen you do it," I said. "Yes," he said. He looked at the stone arch above my shoulder, then through it as if the air had a seam. "I'm old." He left it there. I watched him go, his shoulders set with a working man's habit. If you took the robe off, he would have looked right carrying a bag of cement. On Thursday, the monks processed to the church with an empty place in the line where there should not have been one. It was a literal gap, room between robes, space between heads. The man behind the space, I noticed, walked with his toes a shade wider apart, as if to avoid stepping on a trailing hem. After the psalm, a brother carried a chair into the crossing and set it there as if he had been instructed by a patient hand. The chair looked instantly wrong, like a domestic thing put into a public place by accident, and then it looked perfectly right. The wood of it made sense there in a way that did not change the cold on my forearms. The next morning I woke with a mouth like copper coins. I drank from the sink, and the water tasted faintly of rope, the hose again, or of rubber that had been heated and cooled too many times. My stomach chased away breakfast after 2 spoons of porridge. I put my bowl on the sideboard and wiped the ring it left so no one would have to do it later. Brother Julian assigned me to the storeroom that day, where fluorescent strips buzzed, where cardboard smelled like the cave where cardboard goes to rest, where the walk-in's compressor performed its little apprenticeship in hell. I stacked boxes of candles and counted them, and wrote the number in a little grid on a clipboard that had once been splashed by something acidic and kept a faint lunar scarring. Every hour, the radio on the shelf above the stock table popped and dragged in the static of a voice that never resolved to words. Sometimes it happened when a truck went by on the road beyond the hedge. Sometimes it happened when nothing moved but my hand. Once the radio spoke right at the same time. The receipt printer printed a slip, and I laughed. Not a happy laugh, not even a nervous one exactly. It sounded like a person clearing his throat before telling a lie. That evening, the wind came up in a particular way. moving the trees without showing itself at all on the ground. An advisory went up on the county website. Red triangles on a map I could not see because I had promised not to look at screens between certain hours of the day. Brother Albin printed the notice and pinned it under the other. Gusts, instructing residents to avoid forest edges and stay clear of the upper road after dark. The prior added a line, "Guest house sealed for the night." The door locks were not theatrical, they had no levers or heavy keys. You turned simple knobs, and bolts went into metal cups with a sound I had learned to like in my bones. Friday evening, their custom widened around me like a circle drawn in chalk. The monks filed into the chapter room after supper, and I followed, because the rota had put a faint pencil dot next to my name, at that hour next to the word chapter. The room had stone benches along the walls, and in the center, a single straight chair like the one brought into the crossing. The air had that pricked coolness rooms have, where candles have been lit with care and then snuffed. The brothers moved at the steady pace of men who lift sacks of grain and set them down with gentleness that does not confuse mercy with negligence. They took their places along the wall, heads lowered, hands still. Two left an empty space and held it with their bodies. The prior's eyes had the quantity of dawn to them, work, promise, the knowledge of what still must be done. He looked at me, not at the chair, and said, "Thomas, please." A request that was not optional, travels as softly as a napkin placed at the edge of a plate. I sat. The chair had been used by bodies. The wood offered the faintest of warmth. My palms flattened against my thighs to keep them from lifting and finding the air. The brothers' attention did not touch me. They looked toward the empty space and past it, toward nothing, toward someone's grandfather who had died decades ago, toward the corner where plaster had cracked since the war and been mended badly. Their faces, the odd, fierce gentleness men get when they cannot fix the world but can carry a sack or push a broom. "You know why we leave room," the prior said, "to the room and not to me." His voice had the timbre of a teacher nearing the end of his lesson with boys who had listened badly for years and at last would understand one thing as they tucked their pens back into their books. "We leave room for what could take it," he said. "We leave room for what we cannot stand to see standing." He paused. A draught moved through the narrow windows without moving the curtains. The chair beside me, the empty place where there was no chair, received weight. The arrival felt like a new person sitting in a pew when you did not see him arrive, like the slight yield of wood to a second body. Cold walked the plank of the chair to me and pressed, not cruelly, not even the way a cat touches the place in your ribs where your breath has been. It was a weight, an accounting, a balance being set. My heart began to beat the way it does when you watch your own hand turn a key in a lock you plan to pretend later you never borrowed. The prior was still speaking. His mouth made shapes. Words arrived like quiet, companionable men at the end of a workday, men you had known your whole life, men who always said the same thing, and yet you always forgot what it was a year later. "You have carried your share," he said. He had never met me before 2 weeks ago, and yet he said it with the truth that comes from knowing how much a human body weighs when it stands from kneeling. "You will carry a little more." I nodded, or I did not. In my head, a nod occurred, and my body might have made the smallest movement to give the nod permission. The pressure on the chair told me what it was to be in company without witnesses. Across the room, a brother I had not learned to like or dislike, yet closed his eyes in gratefulness and let his shoulders fall as if he had put down a crate. The chair held a conversation with the air. I could feel the tips of my fingers without moving them. My mouth watered and then went dry and then watered again. My stomach remembered that it had wanted food earlier and reminded me of this in the small ways a stomach can. Someone coughed the cough of an old man trying not to be a problem. The prior's prayer slid to a finish like a plane, landing in steady hands. "Go in peace," he said. because that was the kind of thing he had to say then. The weight in the chair turned a degree and put its regard into my left cheek. It did not ask to be named. It did not thank me. It did nothing that would oblige me to hold it. It simply factored me into its sums. I left the chair and the room in the same movements a person makes when he leaves a Dr. S office to take a simple walk before going home to tell no one. The great silence held. The house's noises came clear. The stair relay clicked. The guest house fridge breathed. The cloakroom's fluorescent had a hum only a bat would love. The printer in the shop ticked and stopped, as if it had wanted to print and backed away from the job in a gust of good manners. My cell had cooled, the window catching a sliver of late light. I rinsed my mug and set it on its saucer, and lifted it and placed it again, because I did not like where the ring had decided to be. Sleep did not come, then slept in my bed without me, and left a crease in the sheet to prove how well it had done at being me. At 02:17, the radio in the gift room muttered, and the barcode scanner woke up and peeped once. A little polite squeak like a chick before it understands that it is supposed to be alive. A slip of paper waited on the counter when I came down at first light. Host. Comp. The printer had nearly run out of ribbon. The letters looked like bones in fog. I wrote a small note to myself and slipped it into the pocket of my robe. It read, "Meet with Prior," but I did not meet with him. There is a way of living where a person behaves as if correspondence had taken place. I avoided him in the slow, skillful manner you use when you have worked in offices, turning down a corridor, choosing to lift a bucket instead of standing in a doorway opening a refrigerator door and peering at a jar you did not intend to use. He did not seek me. That was a mercy. That was its own version of pressure. On Saturday, the guest house reopened with conditions. A notice at the Porter ES desk in the Prior S hand. We ask that guests arrive only if necessary for their soul or their promises. The word necessary has a different life in small places. It gets into your routines. The families who came that day came quietly. A mother set down a bag and lifted a baby who hiccuped and then did not, but looked like he might. A man from the coast wore a jacket that said City Water on the back and walked the cloister stones with a practiced distance from their beauty. The little card reader at the desk cycled its screen and offered its chip slot. The barcode scanner beeped when it should and did not when it should not. The printer printed only when asked. The mother with the baby set the child on the counter and fumbled for a card. The child fixed me with the stare babies have when they have not yet decided which kinds of men to like. He went still and then reached out and put a hand near the little bell no one used. He did not touch it. He put his hand there and waited. My cheek tingled where the weight had considered me. I drew the reservation card from the drawer. The radio clipped to my belt spoke, a soft stuck valve sound, and stopped. And the mother looked around her, her mouth opened like someone who had been caught talking to herself in a dressing room. "Lock will be set at 9. I said, and my voice sounded right because it made itself match the Prior's voice and would have matched any man's voice in that place who had spoken those words. That night, there must always be a night when a thing in a place waits and finds its hour. I took second watch again. That was my name in pencil. That was my space. I walked the corridor with the old triangular flashlight that fills corners without making a theater of itself. The towels in the guest rooms sat in their little folded armies, crisp in the corners from the line, softening only when you pressed your hands along their edges, as if smoothing a disturbance out of a meadow. The mugs on the sideboard had dried. I lifted one and put it to my nose. It had the scent of the dish soap Brother Simeon liked, and a small undertone of stone, which told me it had sat there for an hour in this building's breath and learned what the walls wanted it to know. At 01:03, the compressor in the walk-in clicked differently. It made the sound of a man cracking his knuckles and then thought better of it. The radio hissed at my belt, then quieted, and something, not a draft, not the measurable pressure of air through a corridor, not any physics I could name, something occupied the place beside me. I say beside. It is the best word. It is not right. It had more to do with the edge of the room than with my body. It was like another wall had grown in the night and set its proper angle to mine. I did not speak. I went to the gift room because there is safety in small transactions, even when no one buys anything. I sat on the stool and put my palm flat on the counter where the little printer waited. The paper inside slid with a tiny tick, and a moment later a receipt came through and cut itself and fell and curled like a grub turning in its sleep. Host. Comp. And then below, in the faintest type that machine could make, be a guest. The phrasing was wrong. Not you are, not you will be. The grammar, that anxious ghost in me, felt the irregular friend's hand on its shoulder. I did not show the slip to anyone. I tucked it into the little black bag with candles and counted the taps of my pulse at my neck. When the watch ended at 3, I sat in the chair in my cell and watched the square of window go iron grey and then soften to the colour of paper. I lifted my mug and set it down and lifted it again. The ring cooled on the desk. The tower bell cracked a note for Lords. When I stood, the room stood 2 inches to the left, then was itself again. The days became modular after that, as if made of blocks I could slide in and out of their slots. Laundry and prayer and cleaning and watch. The prior said little to me, and what he did say was practical. The brothers left space, and I learned how not to enjoy doing that. The weight beside me came not always in the chapter room now, but in the corridor, in the refectory, at the stair into the church. One morning I reached for a mug, and a second later reached again, because it had moved half an inch. My fingers came back damp, and the damp carried a smell like the middle of a lily, the sort of heavy sweet that makes your throat want water. The county lifted the advisory. The little map on the porter's desk grew dull. A notice went up and came down. A week of quiet rain passed, and a single day of overdone sun bleached the flags on the square, where no one gathered. The traffic light in the Vale blinked through its colours, with a steadiness that convinced me it had never gone out a day in its life. In the lower field, a trash bag blew like a trapped thought, and lodged itself in a bush, and stayed there like a memory you clean around, but never remove. When the offering came again, I knew it the way you know a cold, by the floaty sense 2 breaths before the first shiver, not by the shiver itself. The prior said nothing. The brothers dipped their heads toward the empty place, and their faces had that look again, not joy, not pride, not fear exactly. The narrower thing, relief, is its own kind of piety. They had arranged the chairs for a chapter that was not in the book. I sat when I was told. The weight beside me took the chair I had not been taught to see. My palms went cold where they sat on my thighs. In my chest, something old made room for something older. What it was, this host they left space for, this presence they placated, welcomed, endured, sat down and did not hide that it was sitting. It did not pretend to be a draught. It was not a trick of the ear or some building hiccup. It was a guest, and I remained a guest in a body I had not yet learned to possess in the ways an old man can in the last year of a life. The pressure was not a squeeze. It was not even a departure. It was something much worse, inclusion. The room flexed. The prior said the words he had to say to make the thing legal in heaven or in the ledger. When it was done, the men stood. Several left with their robes brushing the stone like old brooms. A few lingered with their heads lowered, busying themselves with clasps and cuffs and this and that, making the slow space in which only one brother and I remained. He put his palm to my shoulder. His hand was warm. It was a weight I recognized. "You know," he said. Not a question. "No," I said. The word wanted to be another word. The word wanted to be yes. He nodded. You cannot leave during the hours of silence. Too much would be lost that is needed. Needed, I said back, as if the syllables were keys I had to learn to carry without losing them. He smiled, expressed the smallest sorrow. Everything eats, he said, even God. When you come into a house, you do not make rules. Even if you have lived your whole life making rules for other people, you come into such a house, and your first act will be to keep the door from shutting too loudly, and your second will be to take off your shoes if they look like they have walked in a discourteous way. For a week I kept hours and did work and made room. The brothers made room. The host took it. The chair in the refectory stayed empty, and its plate emptied itself a little each night, as if the prior could not restrain his hand, and always put a small second offering down after we went to bed. On the 7th day of that hard peace, a bus from the city arrived with a group whose leader had not read the notice, and had made promises to people in his care that he did not wish to break. The porter showed them the paper and pointed and apologized. He called the prior, who nodded, and set aside his own schedule, and told me to open the gift room and be ready for people who move in the fast way through places like ours, and try to purchase something like stillness by credit card. They came in, decent, cheerful, weary. They saw the candles and the soaps and the mugs. They asked polite questions and took care not to pry at the things they wanted to pry at. The scanner gun did its beep, and sometimes it took its half-second to remember it had a job, and the receipt printer did its snip, and I read a number out and handed change, and apologized for not opening the pilgrimage wing today. A woman with a camera stood in the corner and looked at the doorway to the chapter room, and raised her camera, and then lowered it, as if something had told her no without making a noise. A boy found the bell no one is supposed to ring and set his hand on it and did not push. I wanted to thank him for that, which would have startled his mother in a way neither of us deserved. At the tail of the group, a man stood loose-hipped near the counter and let his hand find the edge. He had the look of a person who has seen something wrong with a machine and knows it is not yet time to tell anyone else. His eyes moved around the room and did not land anywhere. The barcode scanner beeped. He touched the receipt printer with his finger and lifted it quickly as if burned. "You ever get those slips when you're not printing anything?" he asked. An ordinary question, down in the veil voice, soft as a glove. "Once or twice," I said. "It's a cheap cutter," he nodded. "Our gas pumps do it sometimes. Print a receipt for no sale, just paper fever." He pressed his palm flat on the counter where mine had been the night before, and took it away and did not look at it, and smiled in the small way men smile when they have decided not to admit that they wear a ring, and he kept his hand in his pocket for the rest of the time he stood there. When they left, the great silence fell like a blanket smoothed by two careful hands. You don't notice how much speaking your day holds until a house stops it. The host, either in my head or in the air or in the old boards or in the very idea I had been taught to inhabit, took its seat near mine in the corridor. Not every hour, enough. I worked in the laundry that evening. The towels rolled and stacked. The rhythm soothed. Brother Simeon measured out detergent in silences that were not unfriendly. When I hung the last of the sheets and made the fold and felt the crisp at the corners, I realized they smelled slightly sweet, as if I had added more than soap to the water. The sweetness put a film in my mouth. My stomach made a small, speculative sound. I drank from the sink and tasted rope and old copper. I put the mug down and had to move it again because it had set itself a fraction off center, and the ring it had made bothered me. Night watch again. The corridors changed tempo at a certain hour, as if the house practiced for a new kind of music. The radios went drowsy. The compressor clicks lengthened like a heartbeat that a doctor would make a face over. The barcode scanner in the gift room chirped once in the absence of my hand, then gave out a sound I had not heard before. Two close beeps, brother and brother. I kept the little printer unplugged because I have learned what printers do to nerves. I kept the door from slamming with my heel because I have learned what doors can say. At 02:31, I stood in the cloister under the round of sky, and the host stood in the empty place beside me. I know how ridiculous that reads. I also know how a man knows when he has stepped into a place a dog claims, and the dog chooses not to bite him because he has learned the trick of not clenched hands. The air pressed against my left arm as if night had decided to crowd me a quarter inch without asking. A moth collided with the light over the arch and left a powder that looked like an old ledger's breath. Somewhere in the Vale, the traffic light held green too long and showed red long enough for a story to change. I could have left then. I think often about how a person leaves. You do not go down to the prior with a bag and a speech. You say your ordinary good night, and you go up to your room, and you take your wallet and your phone, and you put them in your pocket, and you hold your breath, and you walk not quickly, not slowly down the stairs, and past the little relay that clicks at odd hours, and you turn the lock on the door as if that is what you always do when you go to close the church for the night. You step into the Vale air, and you do not look over your shoulder because the shoulder likes to be asked not to ache. You go to the road and you walk until you arrive, breathing less hard, and then you lift your hand at the traffic as if a man with a bag is a thing the world will still stop for. You ride away and you go to some apartment somewhere with a kitchen where the refrigerator breathes the same breath you have always known, and you take stock, and you think for a little while that you have stolen something and gotten away. I did not leave. Not because vows, though vows matter, not because I am brave, because I am not because I had fallen in love with the stones and the schedule, though I had fallen into something. I did not leave because there is a thing in me that throws its body across a doorway when a draft comes. It sees 2 candles and thinks a third would make the symmetry hold. It thinks unbidden. If I leave now, the chairs will not be set as the chairs want to be set, and someone with less practice at moving around a space that cannot be seen will be asked to shoulder what I have already put my shoulder beneath. I slept 2 hours before Lord's, and in those hours a dream came with the precision of a document. In the chapter room, the chairs arranged. In the refectory, the empty plate. In the shop, the slips of paper with host. Comp. The host sat in the chair, and then was the chair, and then was the space between 2 brothers where they would not bump shoulders in the hall. It leaned against my left arm and said nothing in words, and I answered with the speech my body knows best, which is to stay. There is a word in the monastery for the man who takes the night hour, the one whose job it is to keep his eyes open so the others may close theirs without insult. I learned it on the 3rd day and wore it like a borrowed jacket. I also learned, no one told me, no one could have told me, the other word. It is not written in the brochures. It is a domestic secret, like a stain on the back of a cupboard shelf where a jar broke 20 years ago and the sugar glued itself into a patch with the flour and whose residue no soap will truly lift. The word does not translate. It meant the chair. It meant weight-bearing. On the final evening before I would have told the prior anything at all, I went to the porter's desk to write a note and found that my hand had written without me. On the paper, host lay over complete. A neat hand, not my hand. The letters had been written with mild impatience and then corrected for the sake of my nerves. I tore the paper and put the pieces into my pocket and burned them later over the little candle I light when I want the room to smell like bees and not like the breath of walls. At supper, the empty plate held the smallest dent of a spoon. The napkin had been folded to a precise triangle and then displaced an inch, as if the person always sat that way and the brothers had learned at last to set the napkin there, because people do not change their positions on such things. The man across from me blinked too long when he looked at the empty place, and then took his bread and dipped it in his soup and chewed and swallowed and did not let the old grief he had carried into this life appear for all of us to see. He finished, and he wiped his bowl, and he set his spoon like a compass with a course. Later, down in the storeroom, I counted candles again. The radio popped and clicked and kept its counsel. The fluorescent hummed steady. The compressor, good and faithful, sighed into its next cycle. The prior came to the door and looked at me and did not come in. His hands had flour on them, which made me love him a little and hate him a little, the way you do men who can both bake and ask you to be furniture. "It will ease," he said. "Will it?" I said. I could not make my voice a question. It came out as a piece of board called a question. "It moves," he said, avoiding the name he would not use. "It holds with those it can, then it moves. We are here to make sure it moves without taking anything that should not be taken." "The host," I said, because I had never said the word to his face, and it had grown heavy. "Yes," he said, and looked at the floor briefly, which was new. "There were words once for such things. I do not pretend those words belong to us now. We have what we have. Chairs, a schedule, the great silence. And me," I said. "And you," he said. He looked at my left shoulder and then at my face, and then beyond me to where the wall met the ceiling. He left. The room felt a half-inch wider when he was gone, as if he had been holding it in. I threw the old towels from the rag basket into the wash and turned the dial with more force than it required. I watched the water tumble and think about thinking. I allowed myself the small spectacle. My hands itched. The itch went into my wrists and into my chest and settled there like a moth behind a lampshade, beating against the paper each time a draft spoke. Toward midnight, a notice flashed on the emergency page in the Vale, the one the brothers consult for our earthquake drills and boil alerts and northern road closures in winter. High wind warning extended. Remain within fortified structures. Guest houses stay sealed after 9. A siren sounded once down in the Vale and then did not sound again. The traffic light held green and cars held red. I took my watch with the old flashlight and made my rounds, resetting the little rug near the refectory where it always went a shade crooked during the day, that domestic obsession that says, "This place has rules even if those rules are not written down." Halfway through the hour between 1 and 2, the host took its chair at my left and neither of us made any show of it. I went to the refectory because it is better to stand in a place where meals were served if you are going to stand at all at that hour. I poured water into a mug from the spigot in the sideboard. Hose taste. The mug beaded with condensation, and the beads ran in the thin lines from other nights, and chose those grooves with rude familiarity. I set the mug down and picked it up and set it down, and the ring decided to be where it would. The door to the kitchen sighed 2 inches open. No wind. I went to it and stopped with my hand on the handle as if waiting for a consent I had never needed. The compressor in the walk-in clicked, and the click sounded like a person at the other side of a wall giving a reasonable knock. I opened the door. Inside, familiar things. Pots on hooks, towels folded with care on a shelf, the seal around the refrigerator door making its little kiss as it rested. I listened, the kiss again, a small courtesy noise a building makes to calm its occupant. The receipt printer in the gift room, 2 doors away, down the hall, spoke itself into breath and printed a slip and cut and offered. I did not go. I felt the little paper cut itself in the air. The host stood close so that my ribs took a slow step that nobody else in the world could have seen. Behind me, the empty chair took weight and then lost it, as if someone had set a plate and then remembered he had left something on a stove he must return to if he wanted to avoid shame. I turned back to the refectory and set my palm on the empty chair and pressed very lightly, and it pressed back lightly with a courtesy that said, "You have been good." I would like to tell you that I made a speech to the brothers the next day. I would like to tell you that I told them the old names for mercy and for their inverses. I would like to tell you that I resigned my keeping and I walked to the Vale and I boarded a bus and the traffic light gave me my favorite color and I entered a world where the fridges hum handlebars. It sigh into the night and the towels soften if you put enough vinegar in the rinse and the printers only print when you tell them. And the floors creak where boards have dried and the sound of your foot on that creak means nothing of use to anyone living or dead. I did none of that. This is how a life ends in a place like St. Taran's. Not with drama, not even with finality that cannot be unstitched. I wake and I fold, and I pour and I go to the chair, and the chair goes to me. I startle when the barcode scanner misbehaves, and then I settle when the gift room smells like paper and soap. I keep the radio clipped to my belt because that is my job, and when it speaks it is only static through which sometimes a human voice calls my name across a room we used to share. Children come with their mothers, and they see the chair, and they do not touch the bell, and the door closes politely because I keep it from slamming with my heel. The county prints a notice, and we tack it, and then remove it, and tape curls away from the paint, because nothing in this world knows how to stay attached forever. The host, comp, the slip say, day after day, skims through miniature rituals as smoothly as the printer cuts its paper. A boy sets his hand in the space beside me and rubs his fingers together as if he had just remembered there are such things as textures. I pour water from the spigot and the hose makes its small whistle, and when I turn the handle, the whistle stops and the silence expands to fill the hole it has been given to fill. At night, I lie in my bed and put my hands flat at my sides, palms down on the spread, because that posture tells my body I am furniture, and the host too can be tired of sizing rooms. When the stair relay clicks and the fridge relearns how to breathe and the traffic light in the Vale shows green to no one at all, there is a pressure that is not a hand and a weight that is not a man that settles into the chair beside my bed. I do not name it. I'm careful with names. I have learned the price of them. I close my eyes and let the building and the field and the river and the hill and the rusted fence around the substation and the tiny screws in the barcode gun all breathe on my behalf for a while. When I open my eyes, I see the edge of the room precisely where it was yesterday. I rise. I touch the towel and find it stiff and then soft in my hands. I rinse my mug from the hose tap and drink and taste something that is not taste at all, but the world's insistence on being itself. I wipe the ring, and the ring remains. I leave room where there will never be enough, and that is the best I can say about my life at St. Taran's. They say in the Vale that the light at the intersection has been slow to change for as long as anyone remembers. They say that the monastery has a way of making the rain feel purposeful when it comes sideways. They do not say that the brothers bow to empty doorways and step aside in narrow halls and set a plate at the head of the table each night and use the word host. With a gravity you will not find in a seminar, they do not say that when a man arrives with his bag and his careful hands and his wish for orders, the house will sit him in a chair one evening and gift him company. And thereafter, the company will not always find him when he least wants it, but only when the schedule requires. If this is a prison, it is one we made for a thing that could not be named by men who knew more names than I do and built better roofs. If this is not a prison, then it is shelter, and I am ashamed of having hoped once for a shelter that did not require someone to sit through the night with his palms flat on a wooden armrest while a presence took the chair beside him and did not speak, and did not touch and did not leave when he asked. I walk toward the empty chair each evening now and set the plate down and set the cup and smooth the napkin to the triangle that is preferred. I take my place at its right. I bow my head a degree, the exact measurement the body holds like old music. Somewhere in the building, a printer cuts a small piece of paper. Somewhere in the Vale, a siren sounds once and then not again, and the traffic light in the center of town chooses, as ever, to hold its green just a second or two longer than anybody needs. If this story lands with you, please like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who enjoys quiet literary horror. Comments are open. Tell me your favorite image or line.